The wind howled across the Wyoming plains in 1882 like a mourning widow, carrying the scent of incoming snow and the rot of broken promises. Constance stood on her porch, watching the last of her wheat wash downstream in a muddy slurry, a mirror of the coins her husband, Duke, had bled away at the card tables. With an 8-year-old daughter to feed and the pantry barren, she was a woman holding back the tide with nothing but grit. She crossed the yard to the barn, seeking the steady warmth of the milk cow, but found the heavy door unlatched, a mistake she never made. Inside, the air was thick with the copper tang of fresh blood and a sound like a broken bellows. In the furthest stall, slumped against the hay, was a man who looked like he'd been forged in a furnace and broken by a storm. 3 dark, angry holes wept through his shirt, and a heavy pistol lay just out of reach of his cooling fingers. But it wasn't the steel or the wounds that made Constance's heart seize. It was the 2 tiny, silver-furred wolf pups buried in the crook of his neck, whimpering as they tried to lick the life back into his skin. Why would a dying outlaw, a man with a price on his head, spend his final breaths sheltering 2 wild creatures against his own heartbeat? Constance ignored the practical voice screaming for her to run to the sheriff. She worked with a paring knife and hot water, pulling lead from the man's chest while the pups watched her with eyes that seemed far too intelligent for animals. When her fingers brushed his skin, a jolt of unnatural, pulsing heat raced up her arms, not the fire of an infection, but a deep, vibrating power that made the barn floor seem to tilt. He woke for a single, terrifying second, his eyes flashing a burning, impossible gold that had nothing to do with the flickering lantern light. He didn't beg for his life. He reached out with a trembling hand, whispering a desperate plea for his kids. By the next morning, the impossible occurred. The 3 ragged holes had vanished, leaving behind skin as smooth and hard as marble. He stood before her, no longer a broken fugitive but a figure of terrifying, regal authority, the Iron Monarch in the flesh. When he touched her jaw, the air between them thickened like an approaching storm, and Constance felt a pull in her ribs that defied every law of the territory. He claimed she was his mate, a truth that made her blood sing even as fear settled in her gut. But as they stood in that fragile peace, the barn door was thrown wide by Duke, whose drunken sneer turned to a mask of horror as he looked at the man he had intended to betray. If the Iron Monarch was truly as powerful as the legends claimed, why was he hiding his children in the shape of beasts? The tension snapped when Duke, fueled by whiskey and spite, reached down to grab one of the pups by the scruff, intending to silence its growl. In a blur of motion that defied the human eye, the outlaw was across the room, his grip on Duke's wrist sounding like dry wood snapping. He didn't just protect the animals, he shielded them with a feral, paternal fury that shook the cabin's foundations. Moments later, in the quiet of the back room, the silver pups didn't just grow. They shifted, their fur melting into soft skin, and their whimpers becoming the hiccuping cries of 2 small toddlers. Brooks stood in the doorway, the gold in his eyes fading but the iron in his resolve remaining, as he watched Constance gather his sons into her arms as if they were her own. The peace was shattered by the sharp, official knock of Sheriff Isaiah, who had been led to the farm by a vengeful Duke. Isaiah entered with his rifle leveled, but he stopped dead when he saw not a monster, but a father standing behind a 6-year-old girl who refused to move. Abby stood with her shoulders squared, a tiny shield for the shifter children, forcing the lawman to see the humanity beneath the myth. Isaiah lowered his weapon, the weight of his brother's lies finally breaking his spirit, and he walked out to deal with the true coward waiting in the mud. 6 months later, the cabin in Wolf Creek was no longer a place of starvation, but a home filled with the chaotic laughter of 3 children and the steady presence of a king who had traded his crown for a hearth. As the first stars touched the Wyoming sky, a howl echoed from the ridge, a sound that no longer brought fear to Constance's heart. She leaned against the Iron Monarch, feeling the pulse that had once terrified her, and finally understood the cost of a sanctuary. If the world ever came looking for the monarch they had lost, would they ever think to look for a simple farmer in the shadows of the mountains? Chapter 2. The monarch's pulse. The flickering lantern light cast long, dancing shadows against the barn walls as Constance worked in the silence of the storm. The paring knife felt heavy in her hand as she moved with a precision born of desperation, prying lead from the man's chest while the two pups watched with an eerie, unblinking focus. Every time her fingers brushed against his skin, a jolt of unnatural warmth raced through her, not the sick, dull heat of a fever, but a deep, vibrating pulse that seemed to synchronize with the very earth beneath the barn floor. For a single, breathless moment, he gasped and his eyes flew open, revealing irises of burning, impossible gold that held more authority than any lawman in the territory. He didn't beg for mercy or reach for the pistol in the straw. He whispered a ragged, broken plea for his kids before slipping back into the darkness. The next morning, Constance found herself standing in the general store in Clearwater, the smell of damp wool and floor wax surrounding her. Her eyes snagged on a fresh wanted poster tacked to the board. Brooks Alluston, $500 reward. The sketch was rough, but the sharp jaw and hard, angular lines were unmistakable. The man in her barn was a fugitive, an outlaw fleeing a robbery. Yet, the memory of his golden eyes and the way the pups clung to him like he was their only sanctuary made the word criminal feel like a lie. She hurried back to the farm, her mind set on turning him out for the safety of her daughter, but the sight that greeted her in the barn stalled the breath in her lungs. Brooks was sitting up, propped against the back wall with a strength that should have been impossible for a man who had bled enough to fill a basin. As Constance moved to check his bandages, she found not ragged holes and swollen flesh, but smooth, unmarked skin. The wounds had vanished overnight, leaving no trace of the bullets she had pulled out with her own hands. "People don't do that," she argued, her voice trembling as her hand remained pressed against his warm, solid chest. Brooks didn't look away. He reached up, covering her hand with his own, his pupils blown wide until the gold nearly swallowed the light. In that heavy, charged silence, he looked at her not as a stranger, but as something he had been searching for across 1,000 miles, claiming she was the one he was made for his mate. The air in the barn thickened like the moment before lightning strikes, a pulse so visceral and ancient that Constance found herself leaning into him, meeting his mouth in a kiss that tasted of rain and iron. It was an inevitable breaking of a dam, a hunger she hadn't known she possessed until this outlaw monarch touched her soul. But the world of men and mud was quick to intrude. The spell was shattered by the rough, drunken shout of her husband, Duke, returning home early and full of whiskey-fueled malice. As Brooks stiffened, his eyes flashing gold once more, the question hung in the rafters. Would the secret he carried in the shape of those pups be enough to destroy them all when the truth finally walked through the door? Chapter 3. The Iron Monarch's shadow. The heavy air in the cabin shifted from the lingering scent of wood smoke to the sharp, bitter tang of whiskey as Duke Fletcher slammed the door open, his presence filling the room like suffocating smoke. He stood with a ruddy face and unfocused eyes, a man who took up more space than he had earned, sneering at the state of a home he had abandoned for weeks. Constance felt a familiar numbness, a practiced stone-cold calm, as he demanded her attention and barked orders. But through the window, she caught the burning, gold gaze of Brooks, the Iron Monarch, standing in the darkness. He was a coiled spring of fury, his stillness screaming a warning that he was one step away from tearing the door off its hinges to protect what was his. The tension snapped when young Abby appeared in the doorway, her small face set with a defiance that mirrored the Iron Monarch's own. Behind her, two small dark shapes pressed into the shadows, their hackles rising as they let out a low, vibrating growl at the man threatening their peace. Duke, blinded by drink and spite, let out a harsh laugh and lunged, grabbing the smaller pup by the scruff. The creature let out a high, strangled yelp, a sound so desperate and wrong that it seemed to pull the lightning from the sky. Before Duke could draw another breath, the cabin door was no longer an obstacle. Brooks filled the frame, shirtless and wild, his chest smooth where the bullet wounds had been just hours before. His eyes were no longer just gold. They were a molten, predatory fire that forced Duke to take an involuntary step back. With a voice that sounded like grinding tectonic plates, Brooks commanded Duke to put his child down. When Duke hesitated, The Iron Monarch moved with a speed that defied human logic, breaking Duke's grip as if his hand were made of wet paper. With a single, effortless shove, Duke was sent flying through the air, landing with a graceless thud in the mud of the yard. As the coward scrambled toward the barn to hide, Brooks remained in the doorway, a towering silhouette of ancient power and protective rage. But the true revelation was yet to come, vibrating in the silence that followed the violence. Brooks turned to Constance, his voice a rough growl as he corrected her terrified assumptions. They weren't pups. They were his children. He gestured toward the back room, where the sounds of animal whimpering had been replaced by the hiccuping, frightened cries of toddlers. Constance pushed the door open to find Abby cradling two small boys, toddlers barely 3 years old, shivering and real, their tiny fingers clutching at her skirt. "They changed," Abby whispered, her voice wobbling as she looked at the children who had just shed their fur for skin. As Constance dropped to her knees to gather the boys into her arms, she felt the deep, pulsing heat of the Iron Monarch's lineage radiating from them. Brooks stood in the doorway, watching her hold his sons with a look of raw, aching wonder. He finally gave a name to the force that had pulled them together. He was a shifter, the Iron Monarch, and she was his mate. The confession was a wreck of truth and danger, a bond that ignored the laws of men and marriages. But as they stood in the quiet cabin, the question remained, with Duke now a vengeful ghost in the barn, how long could the monarch keep his family hidden before the law came to claim the bounty on his head? Chapter 4. The line in the mud. The morning air was brittle, the silence of the cabin shattered by a sharp, official knock that didn't wait for an invitation. Constance opened the door to find Isaiah Fletcher, the sheriff and Duke's brother, his face a mask of weary duty. He pushed past her, his rifle leveling the moment his eyes snagged on the impossible gold of Brooks's gaze. The air in the small room thickened, charged like the second before a lightning strike, as the lawman and the Iron Monarch faced each other across a divide of species and secrets. Isaiah's finger found the trigger, certain he had found the monster Duke had described. "Look," Constance commanded, her voice cutting through the tension. Isaiah's gaze shifted, moving past the threat to the shadow behind the monarch. There stood Abby, her small feet planted and shoulders squared, acting as a living shield for the two toddlers. Nash and Eli clung to each other, their dark eyes wide with a quiet, unblinking fear that made the sheriff's breath hitch. "You're not going to shoot them," Abby said, her voice unwavering as she protected the boys who had been wolves only hours before. Something in Isaiah's face cracked a slow, painful shifting of a man realizing the brother he had trusted was the true villain. He looked at the boys, then at Brooks's hand resting gently on the smaller child's head, a gesture of a father willing to die for his own. The rifle lowered. Isaiah realized Duke had sent him to execute a family, not hunt a beast. Without another word, he turned his back on the monarch to deal with the coward waiting in the mud outside. 6 months later, the morning in Wolf Creek began not with fear, but with the chaotic laughter of 3 children. Constance stirred porridge in a kitchen that smelled of peace and wood smoke, watching Brooks the Iron Monarch tug a backwards shirt onto a grinning Nash. They had found sanctuary in a community where shifters and humans lived in a delicate, honest balance. As the first stars touched the Wyoming sky and a distant howl signaled that the pack was home, Constance leaned into her mate, finally understanding that they hadn't just survived the winter, they had built a kingdom. If this tale of the Iron Monarch and his hidden pack gripped your heart, don't let the fire die out. Hit that like button to support more cinematic storytelling, and subscribe to join our journey through the wilds of the frontier. What would you have done in Constance's shoes? Let us know in the comments below. We love hearing your theories.